In a video recorded on September 25th, Kent Hovind challenged me to present 5 examples of evolution beyond the limits of a kind. It took me a while to get to it because I wanted to make some more general response videos first, and there are other things I do with my time, but I am now ready to present those 5 examples. Before I do though, there are a few introductory things I need to say first. The most important one is to reiterate that Kent Hovind admitted there isn't any set definition of what a kind actually is. To some extent, that makes this whole thing an exercise in futility, because no matter what I say or what evidence I provide, he can always just weasel out of it by saying that whatever I produce is still just variation within the kind. As long as there's no actual definition of what a kind is, the claim that animals bring forth after their kind will always be untestable, but it will also be unfalsifiable. Just my personal opinion. I think that's exactly how they like it. So that's one problem with the very idea of this challenge. Another is that the theory of evolution doesn't claim that one modern type of animal would ever change into another modern type of animal. A modern fish is never going to evolve into a frog. A dog is not going to evolve into a cat, and the theory of evolution has never claimed that they should. Fish will never evolve into mammals again because all mammals are, by definition, descendants of a single mammalian ancestor. Fish can, however, evolve some specific characteristics of mammals, which I'm about to show in a minute here. What I'm not going to show is some amazing 50-50 hybrid of two specific types of animals, because that's not what the theory of evolution claims should happen. When Kirk Cameron said if evolution were true we should be able to find a crocoduck, he was misrepresenting the scientific theory of evolution and attacking a straw man. That's just a simple fact. Now the other point I want to raise is that I'll only be using living, non-extinct organisms. Of course, pretty much the whole fossil record is examples of change beyond the level of kind, but Kent Hovind ignores that. There is a very thorough series of transitional fossils from dinosaur to bird, for instance, but all Kent does is just focus on the one single example that was a hoax and act like that invalidates the entire series. The other thing he regularly does is to say, no fossils count as evidence for evolution because you can't tell whether it had any kids. This is a great example of the common creationist tactic of trying to discredit evolution by setting the bar for knowledge at an impossibly high level. We don't need to know that the exact specimen had kids, because any specimen we find is going to be a part of a larger species, and some of that species would have reproduced. It's ludicrous to say the only way we can consider a specimen a transitional fossil is if we are absolutely certain that the specific organism in question had offspring. In fact, this argument is so ludicrous that I might make an entire video all about that, but let me finish this one first. Now, despite all that long explanation of why this is basically a pointless challenge for Kent Hovind to make, and why I shouldn't even bother wasting my time with it, I am still going to give him the 5 examples he asked for because evolution is so well evidenced and definite at this point that even after all those reasons why the very nature of the question unfairly stacks the deck in his favor, I still do have 5 examples to give him. The first 2 examples are fish. The first is what's colloquially known as walking fish or ambulatory fish. This is probably my favorite evidence for evolution because you might hear people ask, why don't we still see evolution happening? If man evolved from fish that crawled up out of the water, why aren't they still doing that? Well, they are. There are fish that can live on land for long periods of time, breathing through lungs, and crawling along on stubby limbs that really do look halfway between a fish's fin and a land animal's leg. I put links to videos in the description. Seriously, check it out for yourself. Forget all the transitional fossils. These things are living transitional forms. They are literally transitioning between aquatic animal and land animal. My second example is a fish called the opa, which is the first warm-blooded fish ever discovered. Apparently, it's also stronger and faster than its cold-blooded relatives too. Of course, this doesn't look like much on the surface. At face value, it looks like just another fish. And sure, if your way of deciding whether a variation is within the limits of a kind is just to go on face value, then I'm out of luck. But I don't think that's a very scientific way to do things. See, these are the problems we have to deal with when you don't have a set definition of kind, so let's look at the definition of fish instead. On Merriam-Webster's online dictionary, the basic definition of fish is a cold-blooded animal that lives in water, breathes with gills, and usually has fins and scales. So let's review those 2 types of fish I've just brought up. One of them is warm-blooded, and the other can live on land and can breathe through lungs. If you take out all the usual properties of fish which these things have evolved past, then all you're left with in that definition is an animal that usually has fins and scales. In short, the only way you can say that these are still just fish is to willfully ignore the basic dictionary definition of what a fish is. This is far beyond simple variation with a kind. They've taken on properties that fish kind have simply never had before. That's evolution. I almost feel like I should just stop right there. It's not going to get any better than that. If you don't accept that that's evolution, I doubt you'll accept anything. If that's not good enough for you, it's time to just admit that you're closed-minded. But what the heck, I'll keep going anyway. The third example is the American dipper, a bird that looks like an ordinary songbird, but which finds its food underwater. It has various small adaptations which allow it to thrive in that environment, even though it looks pretty much the same as a bird you might find eating from the bird feeder in your backyard. Now, you might be saying, what's so special about a bird getting food underwater? Other birds like ducks and pelicans do that all the time. And this is exactly why it's so important to have an actual definition of what a kind is. I would say that songbirds are a different kind of bird than those which are generally found in water. I think if you put together pictures of a duck, a pelican, a swan, and an American dipper, any 5-year-old would be able to tell you that the dipper was different from the other 3. And it is. It's a songbird, and those are waterfowl. So I think a member of the songbird kind that's taken on traits and feeding practices of the waterfowl kind is pretty darn significant. If you don't, then I think you need to give me a better definition of what a kind is. Remember, one kind of animal is not going to evolve into an exact replica of another kind of animal that already exists. That isn't what the theory of evolution claims should happen. The only thing you should expect to see is animals from one kind taking on certain traits or characteristics of another kind, and that is exactly what we do see. Now, if you want to talk about one kind of animal taking on the appearance of another kind, then look no further than marsupials, which are my 4th example. They're distinct from other mammals in that they carry their young in pouches, and they're generally native to Australia and South America. Despite marsupials clearly being of their own distinct kind, there have nonetheless been numerous marsupial species that evolve similar physical forms as the more commonplace placental mammals. There have been marsupials that look like dogs, mice, rabbits, moles, groundhogs, anteaters, and even a marsupial flying squirrel. Now, compare this fact with the existence of homologous structures. Whales being homologous to land mammals basically means that they look very different on the outside but have many of the same parts on the inside. Kent Hovind's explanation for this is that they're just the product of a common designer who liked to reuse parts. And yet, we have these marsupials who look very similar to a bunch of different types of mammals on the outside, but the internal workings are quite different. So why didn't the common designer reuse the parts from them like he allegedly did for whales? It doesn't make sense if creationism is true, but it's exactly what you expect to see if evolution is true. The other thing that's worth noting is that when other types of mammals were introduced to those areas where the marsupials previously thrived, the placental mammals showed a much higher level of fitness and survivability. That means it doesn't make sense to argue that the designer designed marsupials differently because their design was more suited to that location. History has shown that to be false. So if the explanation for homologies is that the common designer reuses parts that work, then why would he make one type of mammal in some places and then less fit animals with the same outer design in other places? It just doesn't make any sense for a creator to do that, but it makes perfect sense if it happened through the natural processes of evolution and natural selection. The 5th example of evolution beyond simple variations within a kind is human beings. I've never heard any creationists say that humans and apes are within the same created kind, and yet there is substantial evidence observable in our genetic code that we are indeed related to and descended from apes. One of the most obvious is the fact that humans get 23 chromosomes from each parent, and apes get 24. So if humans and apes are really related, there should be one chromosome that shows indication of previously being 2 chromosomes that fuse together, and that is exactly what we find. And it's not just 2 random chromosomes. The fused chromosome matches 2 chromosomes that apes still have. That is, again, quite contrary to the idea that all similarities between organisms can just be dismissed as a common designer reusing parts. This fusion of 2 chromosomes is like if someone was designing a car, and one of the parts was 2 metal pieces from another car welded together. If the person designing that car had unlimited resources, why wouldn't you just get a brand new piece instead of welding 2 old ones together? There's no reason for an all-powerful designer to use something so makeshift, but that's exactly what we'd expect to see if evolution was true. But it's not just the fusion of 2 chromosomes that match 2 ape chromosomes, it's also things like transposons and endogenous retroviruses. A transposon is when one part of the DNA sequence jumps over to another part of the genome. Endogenous retroviruses are when viruses write parts of their own genetic code onto the DNA of the host, which is then passed down to future generations. In both of these cases, genome mapping allows scientists to study the similarities between human and ape genomes, and there is a remarkable similarity between the occurrence of transposons and ERVs in human and ape genetic codes. It makes perfect sense if we share a common ancestor. That's exactly what you'd expect to see. But if the reason we're so similar is because we share a common designer, why would we have these little quirks and scars, many of which just happen to show up in the exact places on the genetic code of animals that are supposedly separate created kinds? It's like if you're using a copy machine and you're making a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy over and over again. If somebody spilled something on the third copy, and you continue to make copies from that, the spill is going to be on every copy that came from it. I don't think it makes sense to believe that the different papers with that spill were just the product of somebody designing that spill into each one uniquely. We have the markings and the scars of being a copy of an ape. You might not like the thought that you're related to an ape, but that doesn't make it any less true. Whether you like it or not, evidence that human beings evolved from apes is evidence of evolution beyond mere variations within a kind. You can spin it any way you want, ignore it, dismiss it, I don't care. The evidence still exists, evolution is still reality, and it's not going away.